This week on Under the Radar, the invasion of postmodernism that threatens academic freedom in Sweden. So a couple of weeks ago in my video Promoting Mediocrity, I played a clip of Christina Hoff Sommers and Camille Paglia talking about what has happened to feminism, how women's, now gender studies departments were created back in the 1970s and where they went off the rails, if they were ever on the rails to begin with. And there's one particular part I want to play again because it's very relevant to this video.
Feminism for me meant that we could be as wild and crazy as boys, or do whatever we wanted to do, enter fields, and to learn from I thought, women finally achieved equality in education. That means that you read the great philosophers, you study the great thinkers, and then you assume that there will be women geniuses, but they will have the advantage of that education, which women at one point did not have. As soon as we get this kind of equality, right. What do? They start tearing down these figures.
They want the women's curriculum, and let's find all the undiscovered women geniuses, the undiscovered female Michelangelo. Well, they've been looking now for decade after decade. But, they have not found any female Michelangelo. There isn't one. Yes, there isn't one. Okay, the quality of my work comes from my admiration of the great masculine tradition. Okay, yes, women were shut out. So what? You incorporate, you assimilate the greatness of the past. I believe in greatness. That was thrown out. That was also thrown out in the 70s. We can't have greatness. No.
As soon as they found out they couldn't find these hidden, then they said, okay, they started
then there's no greatness.
The standards, right. And there was a new, female epistemology, women's ways of knowing. It was all nonsense.
Yes.
Now that's the important point. The Women's Studies Department, instead of embracing the great thinkers of the past, which yes, happened to be mostly white men, tried to seek out the undiscovered female geniuses of the past. And when they couldn't find them, because they don't exist, they just made up their own epistemology, women's ways of knowing. Because as Camille Paglia said, there is no such thing as greatness to the postmodernist. All knowledge is relative, and we need a feminist science because you can't trust the evil white men of the patriarchy that has oppressed the women's for centuries, by sending them off to all those wars while the men stayed at home. And so to Sweden, and this article from Quillette. Academic freedom under threat in Sweden. So Erik Ringmar is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Lund University. Now I looked up Lund University and it ranks in the top 100 universities globally, and it's number 3 in Sweden. It also has the largest student body in Sweden according to 2013 numbers. They have courses in engineering, science, law, social sciences, economics and management, medicine, humanities, theology, fine art, music and drama. So it's not some obscure liberal arts college. Now, poor old Eric has been ordered to include Judith Butler in his course. And if you don't know who Judith Butler is, she's described as a philosopher, a gender theorist, and she strongly believes that gender is socially constructed. The article states, not that there's anything wrong with reading the queer studies feminist Butler, it's just that the course Ringmar teaches is primarily about the reaction to modernity at the turn of the last century with a focus on fascism. During earlier semesters it included a part about postmodernism and within it Butler, but it was removed because it didn't fit within the rest of the course. There is not a course committee in the world which can force me to teach Judith Butler unless I want to, Ringmar noted on his blog. This has led to strong protests from student activists, the board, the director of studies and the dean. Of course, this is no great catastrophe in and of itself. It's just a literature list after all. But it is part of a much larger process by which academic freedom in Sweden is being circumscribed. What is happening now in the political science department at Lund University is fully sanctioned by the gender mainstreaming that the government has ordered all Swedish universities to implement. The department's goal set by the board and approved by the academic board is that the proportion of female authors must never fall below 40% of the reading lists. A course like Erik Ringmar's Modern Society and Its Critics, which focuses on original texts from around the turn of the last century, immediately gets into trouble since fascism in the late 1930s wasn't exactly a bastion of gender equality. So Ringmar's reading list contained too few female reactionaries for the board to be satisfied. He tried to resolve this by including anarchism as another violent political response to modernity, although it was not really the original idea of the course, and unlike female fascists, their anarchistic counterparts actually wrote a great deal. But even so, the proportion of female authors on the course's reading list only reached 15%. It wasn't good enough, according to the board. Judith Butler had to be included. And so I'm going to go back to the point made by Paglia and Hoff Sommers. Because the undiscovered female geniuses of the past couldn't be found, there's a desperate attempt to shoehorn in female thinkers of the past, regardless of whether they have any relevance to the topic being taught and regardless of the quality of their thinking. Why? Well, I'd say this is what happens when you are driven by ideology rather than rational thinking. The ideology in this case being feminism or gender equality. Now, I suspect many of you listening may not be surprised by this if you're aware of Sweden's feminist credentials. The Swedish government is quite proud of this fact and advertises it on their official website. But back to the article. The Gender Equality Plan of the Faculty of Social Sciences makes it clear that teachers must include sufficient literature from gender studies. What's currently happening to Eric Ringmar, a senior lecturer being forced to change his course, has already occurred a number of times according to the Political Science Department's own equality plan. The only difference is that Ringmar protested the decision. And that, I would say, is a large part of the problem. The level of cowardice from academics in speaking out against this stuff. The faculty's gender equality plan further imposes on all subordinate institutions the following: make an inspection of whether and how common curriculums and literature lists are being reviewed, ensuring that gender and diversity perspectives are represented in the faculty's education. It doesn't stop there. According to the department's action plan for gender equality, all teaching staff are required to take a mandatory gender and diversity in education course taught in the Faculty of Social Sciences. All of this is guided by the underlying principle that it is not just about recruiting more women, it's about getting the right kind of gender perspectives which are influenced by the postmodernist and post-structuralist theories dominant within the humanities. While these perspectives may be interesting in some contexts, they are usually strongly ideological and almost always impossible to falsify. Isn't that convenient? The direction to include Judith Butler on his reading list made the Director of Studies and Eric Ringmar decide to not hold the course again. Students who want to learn about the emergence of fascism at the turn of the 20th century need to apply to another university, and all this at a time when right-wing reaction is on the rise again in Europe. This is just one example of academic freedom being traded for a specific vision of social justice, and similar processes are taking place across the country. This process is called gender mainstreaming, and it threatens academic freedom at all Swedish universities. Well, that's a great way to reduce student numbers. Want to learn about the dangers of fascism? Well then, don't go to Lund University. Their course is infected with gender studies. Oh wait, actually, they don't even have a course on fascism anymore. Well, I guess if you're Swedish and interested in topics like that, you can choose another university, right? How about Sweden's second top ranking university, Uppsala? At Uppsala University, ranked number 29 on the Times Higher Education list of Europe's best universities, they declare that their, quote, goal is that as far as possible work on gender mainstreaming from an intersectional perspective. Now, I've talked a lot about the inability of intersectionality to deal with complexity and nuance, but this quote from Jonathan Haidt also reminds us why it is so poisonous to academia. The first thing you do when you interact with people is that you find out which category they belong to. White, that's bad. Male, that's bad. Straight, it's bad. It's called intersectionality. You add privilege points based primarily on racial background, gender, and sexual orientation. Basically, it's a form of racism. It's a form of intellectual cancer because the whole idea of universities is that we're supposed to learn to judge each other by our ideas and words, not by what categories we happen to belong to. Exactly. Several universities report in their equality plans that they will work with norm critique. Both language and research are mainly, according to these theories, production and reproduction of power, and the purpose of research should be to show and break down this power. Therefore, norm critique is considered central, as norms are, by definition, power structures that oppress marginalised groups. Different power structures cooperate to marginalise and repress different groups in an intersectional way. In this framework, the purpose of research is to understand these power structures and deconstruct them in order to build a fairer world free from oppressive norms. Again, this is not a fringe phenomenon. It's now entering the core of the universities through gender mainstreaming. And remember, this is all being directed by the government. There is a wholesale embrace of postmodernism into the university system. If you go back to Jonathan Haidt's distinction between Social Justice University and Truth University, it appears Swedish universities have unanimously opted for Social Justice U. Truth be damned, or rather, it's truth by assertion, as the article states. One would think that the universities have carried out an investigation to determine the extent to which the oppressive power structures they purport to exist permeate their organisations and student bodies. Generally, when you contend that something exists, you need to prove it. But the National Secretariat for Gender Research recommends against this. In their feedback, those who have surveyed the situation at their own universities are mildly reprimanded. There may be educational and knowledge benefits of making local mappings of identified problems, but generally speaking, it's not relevant to present already known structural injustices. No further investigations are needed. The Secretariat already knows what society looks like and the reasons for it. The author states that the Royal Institute of Technology's plan, quote, to a very small extent is about gender equality, and to a very large extent it is about sanctioning a theory of power structures according to intersectionality and gender studies. Furthermore, its only stated definition of an equality analysis is about visualising the problems that arise from the fact that we divide humanity into two categories and ascribe one category more value than the other. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you assert facts into existence rather than proving them. The conclusion is thus already done before the analysis is even made. It's unclear how the engineers trained at the Royal Institute of Technology benefit from this. No such evaluation has been done. And there are other examples from a variety of Swedish universities in the article which are just as alarming, and I encourage you to read the full article if you have the time. But I wanted to conclude with this. I've heard many people say, well, this is just in the humanities. If you're going to do engineering or some other STEM-related field, you'll be fine. And this is probably true for the most part in Western countries. And I'm sure you can still get a decent education in Sweden if you want to become an engineer, for now. But where does it end? Sweden is a blueprint and a warning for other countries of what happens when postmodernism invades and takes over government and then filters down into academic institutions and society in general. So as usual, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'd love to hear from any Swedish viewers, especially Swedish students or those working in academia. I'll see you next time.